Dear students, after studying this module, you would be able to understand the concept of culture and Etic and Emic in culture. Understand the concept of cross-cultural psychology and the link between Etic and Emic approach of cross-cultural analysis. Understand the shortcomings of ethics and Emic approaches to cross-cultural research. Culture is a fundamental, yet often misused and misunderstood variable in understanding human behavior and interaction. It is the very screen through which we see the external reality and can be understood at a supra-individual level. Thus, it is tough for us to consider culture, to see it, for we live in it and with it. The understanding of culture, both our own and another's, become obvious to us when we come face to face with some other culture. Psychologists, sociologists, anthropologists, cultural psychologists have been grappling with the concept of culture, the universe of concepts surrounding it and their implication on our behavior. Cross-cultural psychology, thus, is the study of commonalities and disparities in individual psychological and social functioning in different cultures. It is a methodology for conducting research. It is a paradigm of scientific philosophy and greatly requires an attitude of critical thinking, appeal for culture, and childlike curiosities. The two main approaches to cross-cultural psychological research are the Etic approach and the Emic approach. The words Emic and Etic are derived from the linguistic terms phonemic and phonetic respectively, which in turn have Greek roots. Emic approach is concerned with how local people think according to Kotak. The Emic approach concerns itself with how local thinks. It draws inference from how local perceive and categorize the world, the rules of their behavior, what is meaningful to them, and how they imagine and explain things. The Etic, which is a scientist-oriented approach, it considers the researchers the focal point of research. This approach propounds that local may at times become so involved in their culture that they become incapable of interpreting their culture in an unbiased manner. While employing the Etic approach, the researcher's emphasis is on what he or she considers important. In order to thoroughly understand the impact of and the dynamic of cross-cultural psychology and the paradigm of conducting cross-cultural research, we need to first understand about culture. David also gave a definition where he states that culture is a novel meaning and information structured, shared by a group and passed on through generation to generation that facilitates the groups to fulfill the basic survival requirements by coordinating social behaviors to achieve a viable existence, to transmit successful social behaviors, to gain happiness and well-being, and to infer meaning out of life. According to Triarchic, the objective element of culture are those which are palpable, like food, architecture, etc., while the subjective culture refers to the economic and social, political, and religious practices. To a psychologist, the subjective human elements are of great interest. Cross-cultural psychology can be defined as the scientific study of human behavior and mental cognition, encapsulating both their differences and similarities. Through diverse cultural climates, Etic and Emic approaches are taken in order to have a comprehensive understanding of cross-cultural processes. The Etic and Emic dichotomy in cross-cultural psychology is similar to the distinction between nomothetic and ideographic orientations in personality research, where the nomothetic approach tries to identify general laws and causal explanation. The ideographic approach emphasizes upon the uniqueness of individual. What is Emic? According to the Emic approach, culture is not an extrinsic aspect whose impact on an individual needs to be gauged. Rather, culture needs to be seen as an intrinsic part of human behavior. Human acts are inseparable from their cultural framework. They are not decided by the cause which are analyzed employing techniques of the natural sciences, but are influenced by reasons which are under ambit of the person involved in the process and must be studied in the light of the understanding of those individuals under the investigation. Self-determination or self-reflection is highlighted in this approach. What transpires in the Emic approach is that the subject under research, their entire system of psychological thought and the belief attached to them are also culture dependent, although they are influenced by Western technological and scientific notions of the world. So called indigenous psychology, therefore, attempts to explore cognition and behavior from the vantage point of researchers from the culture and the society, thus emphasizing upon the relativity of the insight gained from Western perspective. An emic account is an account of attitudes or belief system in terms which has some meanings to the actor. That is, an emic account comes from a person within the culture. Emic approach is a culture specific because it focuses on a single culture and it is understood on its own terms. The term emic originated from the linguistic term phonemic from phonemes, which is a language specific way of abstracting speech sounds according to Friedman. What are ethics? Etic approach proposes the need for an explanatory system which is valid consistently over all cultures and allow a depiction of similarities as well as differences between individual cultures. Therefore, equivalent objects and the standards for comparison must be set across in order to make them of a comparable nature. The object of comparisons are taken as variable under investigation, such as aggression as outcome variable or school attendance and socialization practices as generating mechanisms. The standard of comparison is the scale on which the individual levels of the variable under the study can be represented and compared with each other. The method of comparison is engaged to outline the aspect of culture by itself, but to investigate how susceptible an individual is to culture in his action and thinking. Culture plays a pivotal role when it comes to explaining differences in cognition, learning, and behavior. Etic expressions give us an estimate of how much psychological finding may be realized from one's cultural atmosphere to another. Cross-cultural studies help us to systematically break down presumptions regarding cultural influences by adjusting research designs and methods to our new surroundings and culture. An example is given by Malinowski's reinterpretation of the so-called Oedipus complex. According to his observation of the matrilineal Trobriand Island Society near Papua New Guinea, Malinowski found that aggressive destructive dreams of young Trobriand males were directed at the mother's brother, not at the father, as the mother's lover, that is, the uncle with the authority to punish the boy. This cross-cultural comparison was helped us to separate out the variable sexual partners and authoritative figure. Criticism of Emic approach. The Emic approach is a bid to remodel the experimental world of the environment of the individual through his/her own reports and explanations, whereby it is assumed that self-determination and self-reflection and integral part of the Emic view is Morgan's idea of the double induction, which is crucial to reach psychological conclusion. There are those inductions that are reached through the detached study of specific observational phenomena which have been understood in terms of induction reached through the introspective study of mental process. From the Emic perspective, the later induction needs self-reports and self-explanation of the individual's understudy who must verbally communicate the nature of their individual experience to the researcher. The two cautionary measures to be kept in mind are systematic bias and arbitrariness. Systematic bias occurs due to misinterpretation of their own behavior. Arbitrariness is the subjective value of scientific knowledge. Norm and behavior. Self-reports as a data source always stand at a disadvantage because people often systematically misinterpret their own behavior. Reasons that are offered by people are usually decided more by the behavior norms and stereotypes rather than by behavior itself. It appears that self-reports tend to be guided by the social and personal desirability of actions. Empirical studies shows that actual behavior may deviate considerably from the standard which can be inferred from self-reports. Although in some cases there may be conscious dissimulation designed for creating a favorable impression, mostly there is a self-deception that is positively biased reports that the respondent actually believed to be true. Outcome and process. Another reason for misinterpreting one's own behavior could be ascribed to hindsight bias. Reports and explanation of one's own action proceed retrospectively with being completely aware of the outcome of those actions intended and unintended consequences and the expected and the unexpected ones. This facet of our awareness masks the retrospective view of the source and progress of actions. The retrospective observation is biased toward the product or outcome of action and does not reflect much into the process that led to it. It follows from the criticism that one must differentiate between the completion of a series of action and the reflection about these actions. Retrospection happens under the influence of a normative evaluation of the outcome of those actions. In contrast, behavior research emphasizes upon the process and the unintended influences. The danger of arbitrariness. The Emic approach is as culture bound as culturally dependent as the researcher and his premises and methods. This retreat to indigenous or native psychology does not represent a solution. The logical and almost foreboding consequences of its radical form is an extreme cultural relativism that not only prevents comparisons but also appears to reject the possibility of scientific knowledge. The insights gained in this way have the quality of arbitrariness. Critical evaluation of Etic approach. The Etic approach stands upon the model of fixity of culture being regarded as a set of independent variables whose impact on individual competencies and states can be investigated in terms of dependent variables. Cultural membership as an organism factor. Culture should be perceived as a set of independent variables located outside a person. Cultural factors such as ecological factors, child rearing style, or educational system are not experimental treatment factors, but organism variables. Although subjects in an experiment are randomly assigned to a treatment factor, the assignment of subjects to the different organismic factor level is at best a selection according to their natural membership in a particular factor level, which exists independent of the investigation. This kind of research strategy is referred to as quasi-experimental. The biggest problem with this natural membership is that, in most cases, it co-varies with other traits, preventing the influence of the independent variable of interest from being examined in isolation. Due to this lack of separation, differences in the independent variable cannot be causally explained by differences in the cultural factor under study. Further complications arises when one tries to control or eliminate interfering variable with special sampling procedures. There are instances where employing terms like cross-cultural comparison will be wrong, since the assumed independent variable, culture, is not clearly specified as a factor of influence in theory, but rather a catch-all category. However, the consequences of a more accurate theoretical definition can sometimes be that it is more monetarily efficient to carry out investigation on an intracultural basis theory basis rather than cross-culturally. Individual control of cultural influence. There is an even more fundamental criticism of the use of cultural factor as independent variable. This criticism stems from the fact that culture does not represent a unidirectional influence, but rather a systematic framework circumscribing possible course of action. Therefore, the quality and the extent of cultural saturation varies between individuals because each individual constructs his or her personal culture. This is especially so since societies are become less and less homogeneous and the contemporary world is increasingly dominated by cultural change rather than by the cultural tradition. Definition and measurement of dependent variable. The dependent variable to be studied should be constructs, that is, cognitive competencies or psychological states. However, they can only measure in the form of indicators like performance of a test task or an observable behavior. The relationship between the indicators of underlying construct and the construct need theoretical explanation which vary in culture specific ways. If cognitive competencies are studied, the structure of the demand of the given task may not be similar because the solution needed for the task may not be same in all cultures. Points of distinction between the two approaches. For Matsumoto and Zhuang, the Etic approach deals with universal psychological characteristics across cultures, but for Helfrich is too simplistic an approach. In taking an Etic approach, Helfrich argues that the descriptive system must be equally valid for all the cultures and provide for the representation of similarities as well as differences between individuals' culture. In Helfrich's use of Etic, the measure used are equivalent and the definition of variable under studies are operationalized so that what is being measured across culture, the results of these studies, because all variables and all measurement tools are equivalent, allow for comparison between the cultures. In this way, according to Helfrich, culture becomes a factor which can explain the differences between the culture as well as allowing for the ability to determine which psychological result can be generalized from one cultural environment to another. In this way, culture is seen as an external factor whose effects on individual must be examined. According to Helfrich, the Emic approach is more than just being culturally specific. It is an opportunity to view the world through those who are being studied. As such, then the Emic approach shows that everything is cultural dependent and nothing can be separated from the culture. This would seem to go beyond Yuang's presentation of the Emic as the culturally specific in the sense they imply it to mean that some psychological processes are universal and others which are specific to a given culture. Berry contended that both the Emic and the Etic approach are necessary to culture psychology, where the Emic approach is that of local knowledge and interpretation and the Etic approach goes beyond the Etic and is replicated in multiple studies across many cultures so that it is possible to relate variation in cultural context to variation in behavior. Berry cites Pike contending that the two approaches are symbiotic, thereby arguing against Helfrich's contention that the two approaches are opposed to each other and provide a dilemma. However, Berry notes that Pike states that the Emic looks from outside the system while the Etic look at the system from the inside. They are similar in that they are looking at the same thing, but that their perspective is different. In such a way, a more complete rounded picture can be gathered of the processes being studied. Principle of triarchic resonance. In the principle of triarchic resonance, each observable performance is taken to be the result of an interaction between three distinct components: the individual, the task, and the culture. The metaphor resonance is used to imply a dynamic relationship. The word is used to mean a physical body organism with a natural tendency to vibrate at a certain frequencies which build up large amplitude vibration when set in motion by another body or organism vibrating at similar frequencies. Thus, if a body has a range of natural frequencies Some of them can be amplified through external forces while others cannot. Generally speaking, the meaning of the term resonance is that existing tendencies are selectively amplified or muted through external stimulation. If we apply the metaphor to human beings, resonance would imply that every individual has a basic biological endowment whose characteristics can be amplified or suppressed by external force. The external forces can be described as experiences to which the individual has been exposed. Related to these experiences are the situational demands or task and the traditional pattern, that is, the culture. Each of these three components, individual, task, culture, influences each other to the varying degree. Culture can exist independently of particular individual and remain relatively stable in comparison to them. However, this does not mean that an individual can at times enter into a power dominance role over culture and over the task. Therefore, Triarchic resonance principle describes the dynamic interaction of all three components. Amplification or suppression are dynamic processes unfolding over time as follows. A condition once achieved affects subsequent states, but its effects become weaker over time. The result of a single event without any repetition can also weaken with time, either fading away or being overlaid by new events. The impact of an external force depends on the state of the system, which will resonate and where it lies on its developmental phase. Interaction between Etic and Emic. The principle of triarchy resonance provides a universal framework for studying cultural variability. Thus, it could be supposed as an Etic approach, but in order to explain an observed behavior as a product of interaction between cultures, individual and task, both Etic and Emic approaches are needed. The comparisons require an Etic view, but the comparability can only be assured through incorporation of the Emic view. An exclusively Etic approach bears the danger of inferring incorrectly from differences in observed performance to the impact of culture because the relationship between task, competence, and performance is erroneously assumed to be the constant across culture. Therefore, here the Emic approach becomes of paramount importance. Emic approach must be incorporated to explicate the particular form of the relationship. The Emic view can shed light on the culture-specific meaning of a task, how it is conceived, and the relevance attached to it. But the Emic approach is not free of limitation. Cultural and individual self-interpretation tend to accentuate the normative desirable behavior and to eliminate the undesirable. Moreover, cultural and individual self-interpretation bear systematic biases regarding time-bound processes. Retrospective observation favors the product or outcome of action and tends to smooth the process leading to that outcome. Therefore, in order to study of the relationship between the task, competence, and performance, a metacultural view must be adopted. Summary. In this module, we learned that there are two paradigms for viewing culture, Emic and Etic. Emic approach takes culture as not an external factor whose effect on the individual must be examined, but rather an integral part of human behavior. The Etic approach helps us to analyze the degree to which psychological result can be generalized from one cultural environment to another by regarding culture as a set of independent variables whose influence on individual competencies and states can be investigated in terms of dependent variable. Both the approaches have their own weaknesses, such as few major weaknesses of Emic approach are misinterpreting norms and behaviors, dangers and arbitrariness in research, and that of Etic approach are along the lines of assuming culture membership to be an organismic factor, the individual locus of control, etc. Both need to be used carefully and judicially in order to bring forth a comprehensive view of the culture under study. We have seen how the principle of triarchy resonance helps us in the massive endeavor and how we must be careful to order to not commit such errors while conducting a cross-cultural research. We have seen how Etic and Emic paradigm influence each other and is crucial for promoting a comprehensive view of culture. The Etic approach assumes that universal can be identified in intelligence or other psychological construct, and one specific standard test can be applied cross culturally. This relates to the orientation of absolutism. The Emic approach opposes this view and claims for assessment cultural specific measurement need to be developed, preferably by an indigenous psychologist. This should be based on the culture's meaning and value system with respect to the psychological characteristics in question. This approach relates to the theoretical orientation of relativism. The middle way in test construction is called derived emic, whereby the two approaches of Etic and emic test constructions are combined. The different assessments of a construct can be based on the universal underlying process, but the concrete measure, that is, the test items, need to be adjusted to get a meaningful instrument for each particular culture. In this approach, a test with a relatively universal measurement pretension might be constructed in one culture, and subsequently indigenous research from the other culture derives culture-specific version from the universal stem. Empirical comparison between the responses on the difference test will demonstrate whether the test measured the same construct or not. This approach relates to the third orientation of universalism. Thank you.